Okay, so today we're going to be talking about chapter 21, section 3. It's called Central European Monarchs Clash. So after a period of turmoil, as well as absolute rule in most of these nation states, Austria became and absorbed into this new Germanic state of Prussia. So we begin talking about the 30 Years' War, and I want to help you understand that this started because of religious disputes between Lutherans and Catholics. So remember Martin Luther, he gave his 95 Theses, his grievances against the Catholic Church, and it resulted in the split from the Catholic Church and a new branch of Christianity called Protestantism. And the Catholic Church tried to suppress this. They tried to brand him a heretic. They even wanted him burned at the stake. But he was moved around between German princes who saw him really as a political opportunity to resist the Holy Roman Emperor. And so not only did Luther get away, but he inspired other revolts like the Huguenots, Zwingli, Calvin, the Anabaptists, the Separatists, and before you know it, Catholicism is bleeding. People are leaving the Catholic Church, and they are beginning their own denominations. Now, when Protestants revolted against Catholics in Habsburg, the result of this was a war that went on for 30 years. And it was a conflict that became bigger than what it originated. You know, it started out as a religious dispute, but it became about power and land and politics. And so here's a famous painting of the 30 Years' War. You know, you see people pulled from the countryside into the war. Like some of you guys were talking about, it's very likely at 1516 you would have been conscripted or forced into this fight. You just see on the right here, the ones riding horses are the nobility. They've got fancy armor. They've got advanced weapons. But then you see the people marching are probably peasants who have been forced into this conflict. Now, in the early years of the war, the Habsburgs, which really, when you think of the Habsburgs, that's a ruling family. But really just think of it as Austria. So Austria later merged with Germany. They're a predominantly German state, but at this time they were ruled by this family called the Habsburgs. And they were generally winning. They plundered German villages, they took loot and spoils, and they did some really terrible things here. But in the later years of the war, by 1630, the tide began to turn in favor of the Protestants. And this resulted in the Peace of Westphalia. And while the war ended in 1648, it greatly disrupted the German economy. It severely depopulated these regions. And it weakened the Habsburg family, which was the ruling Catholic family in what was once called the Holy Roman Empire. And in fact, the Huguenots, who were French Protestants, actually emerged even stronger. And I guess, all the horrors and terrors of this war, one positive note that came out of this was a way that peace could be negotiated between differing parties. And so the Treaty of Westphalia recognized that Europe is no longer just a series of feudal kingdoms ruled by lords over peasants in manors. It's actually a collection of states, independent states, whose sovereignty is recognized by the other states. And so this is the beginning of modern Europe. And so, if we look at these small German states, this is kind of Europe after the 30 Years' War, we can zoom in and you can look at, the former kingdoms of Saxony and Bohemia and Bavaria and Brunswick, Brandenburg. But you can also see that in these areas, like if we say highlight Pomeria or Silesia or Palatin, then you've got some places where casualty rates were over 2/3 of the people living there in these places. I mean, these populations were devastated. Okay, so again, these red lines here are the boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire. So this was the territory that the Habsburgs ruled over. But the Peace of Westphalia actually recognized these different nations, the nation of England, the nation of France, of Spain, of Poland, and so forth.
As the medieval era.
And so this is a major transition. Meanwhile, the economy in Europe is still based around agriculture. This is still pre-industrial revolution. You have serfs working on the land for lords, and these land-owning nobles are going to be constantly in conflict with a king or a monarch who's trying to suppress the power of the nobility to gain a larger amount of territory and control over a larger amount of land. And so this power struggle between the nobility and the monarchy is going to be common throughout this period. But after the 30 Years' War, the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire was weak. The Ottoman Empire was weak. And so this is really going to lead to the growth of these nation states. Now, after the war, the Habsburgs go on to take more lands, actually to govern a very large empire. It's called the Austria-Hungarian Empire. And this eventually becomes akin to a nation. And, whereas by the First World War, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, still the Habsburg family, really, joins on the side of the Central Powers. They had a strong centralized government. They had a large standing army. And they're going to be a force to be reckoned with here. Now, when Maria Theresa inherited the throne of Austria and became the empress, she, again, is pictured here on the left, is the empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, meanwhile, as Austria is organizing and gaining territory for themselves, their neighbors to the north, the former German states, were ruled over by a family called the Hohenzollerns. The Hohenzollerns of the Prussian state had Europe's strongest army. They were the modern version of Sparta. They exported mercenaries around the world. There were Prussian mercenaries being used by the British Army in the American Revolution even. These Hohenzollerns called themselves kings, ruled over their people with absolute power. When nobles tried to resist, the kings would try to suppress their resistance even through buying of loyalty. Now, the most famous king of Prussia was Frederick the Great. In fact, Frederick the Great developed many of the military practices that were still in use by the time of the Napoleonic Wars. He enforced many of his father's military policies. For example, one of these was that a soldier should fear their officers more than they do the enemy. And that is the only way that these soldiers will learn to discipline themselves in battle. And so the officers carried swords. And it was their job to chase down and kill anyone who tried to run away. Now, Frederick the Great, this king of Prussia, needed a cause to unite his people around. And so he started a war. against Austria to gain the territories of Silesia. Maria Theresa, who was Empress of Austria at this time, worked to resist the power of Prussia. But really, Prussia was the power. It was the military state at the time. So she lost the territories of Silesia. In the War of Austrian Succession, this negotiated peace resulted in this loss of territory for Austria. And as a result of this, Prussia became the major power in Europe. And this sets us up for the 7 Years' War, which is, arguably the first global conflict. It was between Austria's allies with France against Britain and Prussia. And really bled over into territories in the New World. There were colonists in North Carolina who had loyalties and ties to Great Britain, fighting against colonists just on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains who had ties to France. The end result of this 7 Years' War is that France gave up their colonies, lost most of their territory in North America. Britain gained control of India, which they're going to hold on to until the mid-20th century.